Testing. Hi, do I got anyone in Twitch chat? Can you let me know if I sound okay? I'm gonna turn off this. Let me know if my mic is too quiet. I don't know if I can actually make it louder. Okay. Well, if anyone watching can't really hear me, let me know. But I'll just start. So this is the Coach's Clinic on Game User Interface Design. And today, what we'll be going over is what exactly is game UI design, the elements that compose game UI, the process that a game UI designer would take, and classifying what exactly different types of game UI there are. So, just a second. My computer's acting up. Oh, and also we'll briefly go over how what steps you could take to become a UI designer. And if at any point you have any questions, feel free to just type in chat and I'll try to answer it. So, I'm gonna get chat here on my second screen. All right. So if you don't know me, my name's Krista. I'm a UX and UI designer, and I design software for an oil company, but I actually graduated from a school called Savannah College Art and Design, and there I got a degree in game development and interactive design. You might know me because last season I was an Overwatch coach for NESA. So what exactly is game UI? Well, before we even start tackling the game side of it, what exactly is user interface design? So people have different ways of defining this, and you'll see lots of different terms being thrown around, but basically the way I define it is that it is the design of visually communicating information to the user and how they interact with it. So there's two key parts of this. It's the visually communicating information and how they interact with it. And the reason I point that out specifically is that in game UI, there's two main parts to it. So there's a visual side of it where you're making things look nice and pretty. And there's also the usability side of it where you're thinking about how things work and how the user interacts with it. So in game development design, there's all these different types of roles. You have concept artists and programmers and producers and animators and level designers. But UI design kind of sits in the middle because it deals with both how things look and how things work. So what exactly do user interfaces look like in video games? Well, it can be game UI can be start screens, they can be status screens, they can be weapon switch menus, loading screens, character creation, skill trees, game over screens, and there's even UI included in loot boxes. So what exactly are the elements that compose game UI that a UI designer thinks about? Well, I'll just go over them briefly and then I'll go more into detail about them. But game UI consists of color, typography, layout, iconography, animation, and interaction design. So, in color, these are all pretty general things that you would probably know about. But for an example in color, in Mirror's Edge, this game, the whole game uses a very minimalistic color palette. And the game, if you don't know about it, it's about parkouring around the city and fighting these bad guys, but mostly navigating this kind of city that is a white blank canvas for you to run around and explore. And all of the interactive elements of the game are highlighted in red. And the game UI here for the menu takes on that same minimalistic color palette and uses that color red to accentuate the menu and the parts that the user can interact with and directly ties back into the game. So typography, you're thinking about obviously the types of font you're using, when and where. And in Persona 5, the typography is directly influenced from 1980s punk rock scene. So you can really get really creative with typography and what you do with it. Layout is also a really important part of game UI. So in Hearthstone, the UI is considered the game. Usually in mobile games, the UI is the star of the show, but also in Hearthstone, which is a card game, the UI is really important. And knowing exactly where game elements are located and which parts the player needs to pay attention to and knowing when to bring these to light is really important that in the layout design of these games. Game UI designers also deal with iconography. So in Team Fortress 2, there's the kill feed, and in the kill feed, the icons represent the weapons that a player was killed with. So there was all sorts of icons for all different weapons and how they were killed with them throughout the game. So all of those have a very consistent style with each other and making sure that those work well together. And they also visually visually convey what exactly the user needs to know and very quickly and clearly. You also have to think about the animation. So there's transitions, there's little effects, and all sorts of different things that you usually wouldn't think about. But animation can really help bring your UI to the next level. For example, when a user is moving from one screen to the next, just showing like an animation where it pulls up the screen or pulls it to the side lets the user know that they're going deeper within the menu. And when they want to go back to the main menu, if you say zoom out or pull out in the opposite direction that you came them from, it helps them finalize the idea that they are navigating through different sub levels of your menu. And lastly, there's also interaction design. So I'm just briefly going to gloss over interaction design because there's a lot to it. But it's again tying back in the usability psychology, the understanding of what a user needs. And here we have kind of like a wireframe user flow type of deal, and we would it's very important to map out exactly every single interaction that the player can take. So then you design for each of those interactions. And making charts like this really help you understand what exactly the player is doing at all times and how to make that flow better and simpler and faster. So the design process of a game UI designer typically would go like this. So you have wireframes, and then you would do prototyping, and then you would develop your UI so it's in the game, right? Um, so there's this concept of low fidelity to high fidelity UI. So low fidelity typically means that you're working on a much simpler level. It's very rough. You're still trying to figure out the details. And then as you go up through the process, you start worrying more things about how it looks, the color, the layout, uh, what exactly type of fonts you're using. And once you go on in development and you make your eye, the higher fidelity is, the closer it'll look like to the final design. So to briefly go over exactly what these three things are. So wireframing, I call it wireframing, but honestly, you can call it sketching, you can call it just like whatever you want, but typically you make wireframes here. So wireframes are just basic layout comps of what you want your design about. And here you're thinking about usability, the layout, the information architecture of your UI. So information architecture is basically going back to this giant crazy map in interaction design, knowing when exactly the user is going to be interacting with different parts of your UI, and worrying about if it takes me four you know button presses to get to what I want, how can I simplify that? The user probably isn't going to want to go deep into your menus to figure out where exactly they can switch their attachment to their weapon. You want to be able to think about those types of things. And at this stage, you can use things like Photoshop, Illustrator, just to quickly map out digitally your UI design. If you don't have Adobe Suite, there's even GIMP, which is free. And honestly, pen and paper, you'll hear this a lot if you work in UI and UX, but pen and paper at this stage is pretty common, is really all you need, as long as you can quickly convey your ideas to developers. So then the next stage would be prototyping. So prototyping is taking that UI, that base design that you have, and then making it interactive. And doing this is so then you can make it quickly and not actually have to worry about getting a developer to code and make the thing, but just to show like simple interactions. So if I click here, it goes to this screen. If I click here, this happens, this menu pops up, this item shows up on my screen. And at this stage, you're thinking more about the visual design. So you're thinking about color, you're thinking about typography, and you're also thinking about visual hierarchy. So visual hierarchy is so when you look at UI or anything, so for example, if you see a header, it's usually in big bold letters, right? And that's what draws your attention first. And then under that, there's usually a subheader. and that subheader might be a smaller size. It's the same font, but it's not in bold. And then after that, you have your body text, which is a more legible font. It's probably sans serif, and it's usually against like a white background, so it's easily readable and you can read a whole lot of text. So what I described there is visual hierarchy. So there's things that the user draws their attention to first. And as they go on, you draw their attention to other parts of your design. And this is really important because you want to know where exactly your user is looking, and knowing when and where exactly to capture their attention. And all of these different elements, they all kind of go in together. So the types of tools that you can use here, I'm not quite sure with in the game industry, but you can use Sketch, which is for Macs, and I don't use Sketch. There's Figma, there's Adobe XD, and I've even seen game developers use Flash to make quick prototypes of their thing, because this isn't the stage where you're making things completely final. You're just trying to get something quick out there. And then lastly, you're going to be developing your actual UI. So depending on which company you work for, whatever project you're on, you may be having a hand in the actual UI and implementing it within your game. So you're working with programs like Unity and Unreal and GameMaker. But a lot of times you're kind of more thinking about the interaction in the UI. But at this stage, there's a lot of coding, there's text testing, and there's bug fixing. So, um, some ideas I wanted to go into is classifying in-game UIs. So, game UI design isn't always menus and health bars like we think. So, there's two concepts to be aware of when we're classifying game UI. So, is the UI in the 3D game space? Like, I can actually see it within the game? And does it exist within the fictional game world? Like, do the characters in the game know about this menu that I'm bringing up? So, depending on how you answer these two questions, you get different types of UI. And those UI are non diegetic, spatial, meta, and diegetic. And what I've learned making this presentation is this is actually a very watered down explanation that for this concept. But for some reason, everybody like one person wrote like a paper on game UI and how it's represented in a 3D space and within narrative fourth wall. And they made a chart that was like this, but this is not the full chart. But for some reason, somebody took this chart and said this was how it was, and now everyone says it is. But there's actually like a lot deeper elements that go into this chart, but I'm not going to go into all of those right now because we would be here forever. But so non-diegetic, spatial, meta-diegetic. What do these all mean? So first we have non-diegetic, and non-diegetic is interface that is rendered outside the game world, only visible and audible to players in the real world. So players like you and I can only see the UI in most games. So most games have this type of UI where it's like, a menu or whatever that you interact with, that you click around, that you navigate through, but the player in the game like has no idea that this thing exists. And it only exists to the player, you and I. Next, there's spatial user interfaces. So spatial UI exists within the game's 3D space, but it exists within the game's 3D space, but how do I say this? Well, it says with or without being an entity of the actual game world. So this goes back to the two questions that we had. Does it exist within the 3D space? And do the characters of the world basically know that it exists? So spatial would mean that it's in the 3D space, but the character, it doesn't exactly tie into the narrative. So here we have like the detective vision mode thing of Arkham Asylum, Batman games, and this is visually represented within the 3D game, but it how do I explain this? The characters exactly may or may not know it is, but it's within the 3D space. Anyways, moving on. So meta is like the weirdest UI, and I hate explaining it. It doesn't really make sense, but to simplify it, meta UI are representations that exist within the game world but are only visualized on the 2D hub plane. So, um, the whole point of all this classification is classifying games within a 3D space. So, with something that's meta, it's something that can it's representing something that would actually exist in the game, but it's only showing it to the player on a 2D space. So here we have like Rainbow Six, and there's splatters on the screen indicating that the player are getting hurt, and the blood splatters are something like you taking damage, you bleeding, is something that would actually happen in this game's narrative, right? But the only way we're representing it is in a 2D plane. Hopefully that makes sense. And lastly, there's diegetic. So we had non-diegetic before, and now we have diegetic. So diegetic is interfaces that exist within the game world, and they can be seen and heard by game characters. So this is the opposite of what we were talking about before, where they have game characters have no idea this exists. And whenever you talk about UI, the most infamous UI that people point to is the UI of the Dead Space games, because a lot of the UI is not displayed on. It's displayed within the game because it's diegetic. So can't really see here, but when the character in the game pulls up the menu, it actually exists within the 3D space, kind of like a holographic graphic, whatever. And he can access his menus and inventory, but the character in the game knows of its existence knows of its existence within the game's narrative, and so does the player. So it meets both of those questions that we talked about before. Hi, Emily. You're welcome. Thanks for being my students. I miss you guys. I left the Discord because I was getting too many notifications, but it's good to see you. Anyways, so another small thing that I wanted to point out here is that the health and status of the character, usually that's represented on like a little bar, like in the corner of the screen, right? But in Dead Space, it's actually on the 3D character in the game. So if he takes damage or whatever, or he's running out of ammo, it's shown here on his character model. So let's do a little bit of a test of how of what we just learned. So here we have this screenshot from Overwatch, and there's all different types of game UI elements, and I'm just gonna sit here and take a few seconds to let you guys think about what types of game UI are in this screenshot. So we got this team kill text on top. We got the ultimate icon on the bottom. We have the different weapons and abilities in the corner, your health in the other corner. This target UI type of thing on your teammates, the names over the teammates, all of that stuff. So, first of all of this UI here that's displayed on a 2D graphic, that's non-diegetic UI. That's UI that the characters in the game, they have no idea about. They probably figure out their ultimate just by feeling it. I don't know, but for the player themselves, the way that they know about this information is indicated on a 2D plane that the game characters within the game have no idea about. And this UI, the UI that's shown over the characters and in the game environment, this is spatial UI. So these are UI that exists within the game. It's not on a 2D plane, but the game characters still don't know that it exists. Well, maybe they can kind of see this outline of the point here, but I highly doubt it. Like, why would there just be this glowing outline around this car. Yeah, it's the future, but I kind of doubt it. But the fact that this is in the 3D space, so when the character moves around, this UI moves around with them, that indicates that it's spatial. And there's actually one more piece of UI that to point out here, and that's the it's Mercy's, weapon, medigun, whatever. And this is diegetic. So when we talked about Dead Space earlier, we talked about how information was visually represented on the character model. Well, there's all different elements to point out here, but the most obvious one is that when Mercy switches between her damage boost and her healing on her staff here, it either has a lightning bolt or it has a cross to indicate which mode she's in. And there's actually more to it than just that kind of graphical interface. When this game model here that the player sees, when it switches between different weapons and she uses different abilities, so when the beam connection is white or yellow, it indicates different information visually to the player. So that's why when I defined UI earlier, I said that it could be information that's visually conveyed to the player. It doesn't necessarily have to be graphical UI for it to be UI, in my opinion. Some people might think otherwise, but that's that's how I would see. So hopefully that makes sense. Um, so to go over briefly, how exactly would you become a game UI designer if you were interested in all of this stuff? So, if you ever come to any of my clinics or ever talk to me about game development or anything, you will always hear the same thing. I always say, just make something. It doesn't matter what it is, just make anything. And it doesn't have to be good, it doesn't have to be great, but as long as you make something and you practice and you keep trying, then that means better than doing nothing, right? So, what types of things can you make? So, you can recreate the UI of one of your favorite games. So, you would take the user interface of any game. So, Overwatch, you would take that whole screen, and as everyone knows, the UI in Overwatch can get a little bit crazy, um, and try to just simply recreate it just from scratch. So then maybe you can get more familiar with the tools. And as you make it, think about like why see the different elements that are used over and over again throughout the game. You can also redesign a game's UI, so don't just recreate it, redesign it. Think about I parts of the game that you can improve. So you can, so if in Overwatch there's way too much text on the screen indicating it, think about how you can simplify it. Think about like, okay, somebody just use their ability. How can I show that in a way that doesn't require UI and clutters the screen? Or you can just create a UI totally on your own from scratch using your own idea that you had since you're 3 years old or something. Just whatever it is, just make something. And to clarify, recreating or redesigning a UI of a different game, that would be called a case study, and that would be something you would put in your portfolio. So when you're doing any of these things, always think like a designer. So all of the things I mentioned before, um, those are all within the context of the player. So it's called user interface design, right? So it's user centered design. You're not designing for yourself, the designer, or the developers, or the producer, or the person who's throwing money at you to make this game. You're designing for the person who's going to sit down at home, turn on the computer, and play this game. So you always need to think of context of what is that person going to be experiencing. And whenever you make any sort of UI, ask yourself a lot of questions. Ask yourself why. That's the most simple way I can explain principles of a UI, basically. But just always be asking yourself, why did I decide to use this color? Why did I decide to put, this button exactly here or over here, and don't worry about getting it right the first time. So, in game development and just like software development in general, there's this idea of iterative development where you're kind of just making things over and over and over again and learning from your past mistakes when you're making your new design. And that's why we have the idea of low fidelity to high fidelity um, design. So when you're working at low fidelity, because you're only thinking maybe in black and white, pen and paper, you can easily try out many different ideas quickly and then learn from that and then make something better. And don't be afraid to just use pen and paper. I know that sounds really weird, but to people who work in user experience and user interface, just showing that you think at such a low fidelity really shows that you're not, pushing pixels. You're not overly concerned with unnecessary things. You're really doing your job and the usability side of things. And whatever you do, just keep learning, keep practicing. The way that I approach design is that I learn lots of different elements. So UI design is a little different uh, from different parts of development, right? You're thinking about things visually, but also the usability of things. And um, what I do personally is that I learn all different types of little elements. So, consistency, hierarchy, all that different stuff. And then I just apply those little bits of ideas and kind of like little rules to whatever I create. Um, and keep practicing, keep making things, be iterative, don't be afraid. And if you're just a student and you're thinking about becoming a game designer or going to college for it, as long as you show that you have made something, then that's really great. That's really good, especially to when you're applying to a school. So I went through that a lot faster than I thought I would. Um, so if anyone has any questions, type it in chat. But um, I prepared just in case this happened, just to quickly look through it. So you can actually find the in-game UI style guide for League of Legends. It's on the designer's Behance portfolio, which is really great. And I kind of wanted to show what a style guide for a game UI would look like. And this one is really simplified, and there isn't a lot to it, probably because of NDA, but to show what a AAA game would look like. So here they're emphasizing clarity in League of Legends, right? So first we're going to go over the different types of concepts. So they have here all these different things: communication without words, clear visual hierarchy, less is more, immersive experience. Again, these are all concepts that are user centered. So you're not only just thinking about the visual side of it. So communication without words, immersive experience, less is more, clear visual hierarchy. These all kind of build off each other, but they've decided this is the key concepts to their games. So design elements. So we're thinking about shape here. So it says combination, subtraction, and intersection of a few simple elements such as a perfect circle and either squares or rectangles. So they've clearly limited themselves to squares, rectangles, and circles, but it subtracts elements of this rectangle here. And this is adding and subtracting these two different elements. And then we have the color palette here. It's pretty dual tone. Greenish teal is the main background color for most used, and gold is an accent color. Combination of dark teal and gold creates a harmony of cold and warm. That's good. They also have these custom colors here, specifically coded to represent certain functions such as health, mana, blue, and red teams. And of course, they've also figured out the typography here. They use Beaufort Bold and used in the Ghast HUD. Numbers and hotkeys are very important in gameplay data. Again, thinking from user-centered. They are rendered in bright colors for best readability. Casing, so the style they decide to use for their different UI elements. The portrait frames are always circular, so when you see a portrait, it's always in the circle, right? So that's consistent throughout the game, and it helps you easily recognize that. Buttons, same as casing, buttons have a gold outline. Shapes are either square, circle, or a combination of them. Slight gradients are applied on gold outlines vertically, and I know they'll explain that later on, but there's also the iconography, so here's all the different elements, and they all have a consistent style. Most icons are very small, so the readability is important. To ensure readability, the icons have clear rendering and simple shape with limited use of colors. So this is what the icons look blown up, and this is what they look like at their actual size, really small. So they have to design knowing that they're going to be that tiny. And for consistent use of gold, we developed standard Photoshop blend mode. Now material, they have all of those gold and teal colors, right? So gold is the one and only material. It should be polished and thin and narrow plates. The use of gold is limited. They really thought this through. Graphical treatment with minimum lighting information, flat yet helps shape definition. And then there's also magic. Magic in the game is used primarily for two reasons. Important functionality, level up in abilities to create mood and support thematic cohesion. So it goes back in the whole gameplay of magic. When it's used for functionality, it is animated. And this is what the actual in-game final design looks like. So this is like the actual style guide. Sometimes if you ever look up style guides or game UI of anything, you might find people who have also created their own version, like I said, a case study of an existing game, but so you want to make sure that you're not looking at some students' work, but this is actually made by the designers and developers of League of Legends. Yeah. So hopefully that is okay. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep talking for about another 15 minutes. I always go through these things a lot faster than I intend.
Just go along with whatever I say.
Okay. What are you gonna
There is this one UI that I find really interesting. This was actually the This is actually the game UI style guide, user interface style guide for the Division, the first one. I know the second one is an open beta right now, but this is the first game, and I didn't want to show it because it's actually in really low quality. Like, look at this JPEG stuff, but it's really great to look at because it's extremely extensive. It's like the entire guide that was leaked. It's really bad that, you know, we get this internal document, but it's really great to see actual stuff that was used in successful games. So core pillars defining UI, defining text style, visual ingredients, colors and opacities, text and legibility, iconography style, shaders, camera, motion animation, menu system. So core pillars, again, the same concepts of League of Legends UI, simplicity, functionality, consistency, directly understandable, diegetic, probably spelled differently because I think Ubisoft is Canadian French or French company. So fun fact, this UI, I was always really excited about the Division ever since the trailer came out for it during like the game developers conference like a long time ago. And one of the things that they showed that was really cool was that they had when the player opened the menu, it would show on the 3D game, right? So diegetic, and you could see it and interact with it. Well, there's actually a video out there. If you're ever interested in game development and you want to learn more, a great educational place is the well, Gametsura is one, but other one I'm thinking of? I can't remember, but I think it's GDC, the Game Developers Conference Vault. GDC Vault, yeah, GDC Vault. There's a GDC Vault video of the developers going through the creation of the UI, and they talk about how this whole concept that they made in the demo was completely not feasible, or it was just too much of a hassle to make or whatever. So in the final game, the first division, they don't show maps like this at all whatsoever. Oh wow, they talk about the same stuff: meta user interface, spatial user interface. So they're talking about how it works on a 2D plane versus a 3D plane, and it needs to be able to look like the player inside the game can interact with it. So here the UI on the characters watch shown in a 3D space. It's really cool. Thinking in volumes. Incorporation of Z-depth. If you don't know what Z-depth is, it's like, if you ever heard of 2.5D, it's like that. Finding the tech, what is the OS? So they even thought about what exactly is the OS that the fictional game will be using, and they design all of that from the bottom up, making sure that it's consistent everywhere that it's used, because the characters in the game are going to be using that throughout the game, right? So I think that's really cool that they even went in and made their own fictional OS. So where is the OS? On his gear, on a 3D plane, mathematical, non-organic, spatial, flexible, program-generated design, and describe the visualization of digital information. Dang. I haven't actually really looked at this. Behavior infographics. Mechanical R&B visualized using the OS style of behavioral infographics. So they thought about engineering schematics, real-life references, imperfect software. That makes sense because, again, it says here the world within the Division is broken, and because of this, so is the technology. So if you don't know what the Division is, it's a game that's set in a post-apocalyptic world, and it's this whole division of agents that go around like helping people and doing different stuff, and it's set in NYC. Points, lines, and shapes. Define shapes that are light and airy. Reinforce a navigation pathway. Guide the eye through the animation. It's pretty good stuff. A point defines location, object, or monument in time. It is a node. So talking about how these different interactive things and how they look like within the 3D space, if it's closer to the player versus how far it is. So as you can see, like, a lot goes into game UI design. You know, it's not just like making a menu that says start game, load game, you know, delete game. There's a lot that goes into it, especially if you try to create a game in a 3D space in diegetic wise. And it's really a challenge, but when, as you can see, when you can pull it off, you can really pull it off. And if you've played Division 2 lately, if you've been part of the beta, the what do you call it? The UI of the game is a little bit atrocious. But the UI of the second game is extremely busy. It feels like they threw out a lot of these concepts out the door, right? Meta, spatial, or what is it? Simplicity, consistency, directly understandable. In the second game, it's like they took this whole design and they pushed it too far. So they were completely obsessed with the idea that it's in the 3D space, right? In Division 2. But the way that they implemented it, the UI gets way too busy and it gets way too confusing. So you never really, it's really confusing to understand which part of a menu you're in, you know, in the sub menu, like that visual hierarchy. And a lot of the effects get in the way of, you know, actually being able to use the UI, understand what it's saying. So it's really interesting to see how, something that defines the UI so well and so detailed, and making sure that it goes right? Because if you don't understand, if you don't design your UI with specific rules, as you can say, set in place, then you can really go wrong. And that's why it's very important to iterate. So, what else? We have the color. So the orange is a really important part of the game. Primary colors, orange and white. Secondary colors are gameplay colors. Secondary colors can bring information in the context by highlighting as positive or negative. So these are really good saturated colors that really display well against the post-apocalyptic background of the game. Here's their typography. Text at extreme angles are illegible. So text sizes vary within distance, backgrounds vary in color and value. I think this first part, text at extreme angles are illegible, is really interesting to me because, again, it's in a 3D space, right? And they're thinking within a 3D space, but they're still keeping the usability of it in mind. They know how much is too much. See this tilt 35 degrees. You have different ones. Layers and treatment. Z-depth should be utilized to both enhance legibility and draw attention to important information. The layers of text broken down. Honestly, like, looking at this is the final thing, right? And then this is it broken down. I don't know how I feel about this because it's really... You can go really wrong with this, right? Like, too much. But for some reason they got it working. And then this is the... Especially when you're designing UI, you're thinking about the different states that your player's interacting with. So this is like the UI on its own. This is when you are interacting with it, or you can interact with it, and this is when you can't interact with it, right? So you have to think about all those different states. Shaders and VFX. Style, glitching. Here's all the iconography. Symbols should be clear, immediately understandable, and easy to read at a small size. Ensure that fine lines are not too thin at small sizes, and overall symbol feels like one solid form. I don't know about this one though. Like, this is the example they use, but when you look at it over here, it's kind of hard to read because they layered it on top. I thought it would be the other way around, right? Like this, the white on top of the darker color. But here they did the opposite, so... And that doesn't even make sense because here they do it like that, right? Seems like the white is on top of the darker color. Not sure what's going on there. Character is king, so fixed UI. So yeah, whenever all of the UI art is in perspective of the character itself in relation to the player's character. What would you say is your favorite HUD and why? Hi, Crispy. I don't have a particular one. I think the Dead Space one is like the go-to one whenever you're talking about game UI. But I mean, I actually haven't played the game yet. I own both of the games, or all of them, and I haven't played it yet. But I can say for one thing, it is not the UI of Overwatch. It is just too crazy. UI and MMOs can get way too much. Like, I know I personally don't play a lot of MMOs because the UI of them is just so crazy and so busy, and it's harder for a player to for newcomers, right? To digest. It's always just been a turn off for me. The UI in Persona 5 is really good. Not good. Good is objective. It's very interesting and stylistic, and it brings a lot of character to the game and definitely plays into the game's themes. But like, this stuff is not readable to me. It's just a little bit too crazy. Like here you can see that they try to be like fun and creative, right? By changing one of these letters to black to contrast it, but it honestly just decreases the legibility of the whole thing. Because like, look at this. Like, if you stand back and like, there's a web design technique to like test the usability of your design, and that's literally like the squinting test. I forgot what it's called exactly, but basically you kind of step away from whatever it is you design and you just kind of squint your eyes, and then you think about like the visual hierarchy of it. Like, is it easily distinguishable? And it's especially important in web design UI, or web design, whatever, the visual hierarchy and of things, because a user only stays on a website for how many more seconds until they leave, right? So you have that certain amount of time to properly capture the user's attention. And if the user doesn't understand exactly what it is that you're trying to sell to them or show them or teach them, like within a few seconds, then they leave. So same concepts, like those are concepts that are in UI, in web and other different types of UI, but in games it can still be applied, right? I can see where exactly my attention is supposed to be drawn to, you know, whatever. So when you look up game UI and like try to learn more, I think it's really interesting, because when I was in school and I wanted to do UI specifically for games, when I was in school like 4 years ago, you know, we had the internet, and the internet had been around for a while, but there was just nothing on game UI. And creating this presentation, I learned that there's a lot more on the internet now. There's a lot of cool stuff that you can use to learn, but to find like the process to make UI specifically for games is still a little bit difficult. So if you're interested in this type of thing and you want to learn more, like look at other stuff. Look at how to design for mobile, for tablet, for web, for everything, because those are still all like the same concepts that you can apply to games. And even if you work on those different things, that's still like a viable portfolio piece, right? If you say are later down the line and you decided, like me, to be in software, and then you're like, I want to transition to games, and then you that all of those little decisions that went into your designs making other things can still be applied here in games. So a lot to learn. Don't stop learning. Well, it is 9:30, or 9:30 in Central Time. 8:30 or 8:30 in Pacific, right? Or I don't know, whatever. But this will be the end of my clinic, and I'm gonna stop here. But if anyone has a question, I am on the NASIF Discord, and you can at me. Or if you have a coach, you can definitely ask them to get me in contact with you or whatever. So, thank you for watching.